The movie begins at a U.S. Army base in Iraq, where a group of young soldiers record themselves during their routine drills as they await their longed-for return home, scheduled for 28 days. Despite their complicated situation, the soldiers always find a way to have fun, whether by sparring with each other, playing cards, or even singing military chants. But when duty calls, they must respond. They head to the city of Tikrit, where they watch vehicles coming in and going out. Suddenly, they hear distant gunfire, though considering the location, they don't give it much importance. At that moment, Sergeant Steve shows his buddy a photo of his beautiful girlfriend, whom he hopes to see soon. Their conversation is interrupted by a speeding car approaching their position, though it stops at the very last second. It's a frightened family that just wants to leave the city as soon as possible, so the soldiers let them through. Seconds later, however, a car of Iraqi insurgents appears and opens fire on them before taking an alternate route. Right away, the soldiers abandon their post to pursue them through the city streets. Since they cannot shoot because of civilians, they have no choice but to chase their targets into an alley, where they exit their vehicles and go on foot. As they advance, the squad is surprised by the sudden quiet in the area. By the time they realize it's a trap, it's too late. A bunch of enemies begin firing on them from the rooftops. Now they are forced to fall back, though the Iraqis blow up their vehicles with an RPG. As if that weren't enough, the insurgents also fire a missile from the rooftops. Just then, Soldier Rodriguez throws himself over his comrade Tommy to shield him from the explosion. Although Rodriguez survives the incident, he is seriously wounded. While his teammates carry him into a house, Soldier Paul tries to hold his position, but the insurgents gun him down as he reloads. After the death of his friend, Tommy opens fire on the enemies recklessly, while Steve breaks into another house to make it to the rooftops. Seeing his comrade without support, Sergeant Brandon decides to follow to help him. Finally, he finds Steve crouched down, trying to protect himself with his last magazine. Brandon throws a grenade into the room where the enemies are hiding. After the explosion, the sergeant checks for casualties, finding the body of an insurgent next to a family of civilians whom he has accidentally killed. Shocked, he returns to Steve to bring him to safety. Back at the base, the squad honors their fallen brothers from the ambush with a video showing their best moments together. At last, the soldiers return to the United States, specifically to Texas, where civilians welcome them as heroes. Meanwhile, their Lieutenant Colonel Miller asks them to behave themselves. Despite the losses of their comrades, everyone tries to maintain a positive attitude, especially in front of their families. Steve's girlfriend, Michelle, sneaks into the parade just to kiss him. Then both Steve and Brandon are decorated with the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart in their hometown. After the ceremony, Brandon reunites with his parents, who could not be prouder of his heroic deeds. There he also receives congratulations from Orton, a senator who promises to help him in any way. The action continues into the night, where the soldiers, now as civilians, gather at a bar to have fun. However, Steve drinks so much that he begins describing in great detail all the horrors he experienced in Iraq. According to him, he does not plan to return to the army because he's tired of urban combat, preferring that the government drop colossal bombs on their enemies to end the matter. Tommy is also a bit drunk, and when a man invites his wife to dance, Tommy attacks him as if he had been disrespected. Fortunately, Brandon and another squad member stop the fight before it escalates. In the early morning, while unpacking, Brandon gets an unexpected call from Michelle, asking him to come to her house for an emergency. It turns out that Steve, as a victim of post-traumatic stress, is digging a hole in his yard leading nowhere. He has destroyed much of his house and even slapped his girlfriend. Brandon is furious to see what his friend has done, but Steve is so drunk that he just lies down to sleep in the hole with his pistol. While Brandon stays to watch him, Tommy suddenly shows up and crashes his car into a pole, apparently because he fell asleep at the wheel. Brandon discovers that Tommy has a trunk full of wedding gifts. Tommy then admits that his wife kicked him out until he returns to normal. The next day, Brandon takes his brothers-in-arms to a ranch on the outskirts of the city where they shoot at Tommy's wedding presents for fun. Suddenly, Steve wakes up in the trunk, struggling to get out despite his hangover. He transforms completely when he picks up a rifle, showcasing sniper-like precision as he shoots all the targets to end the game. Later, when Steve has fully sobered up, Brandon confronts him about hitting his wife. They almost come to blows, but Steve ends up apologizing and promises not to do it again. The following day, Brandon reports to the military base to complete his discharge paperwork. However, he's surprised to learn that he must return to Iraq under the stop-loss policy. This is a controversial practice that forces soldiers who have already completed their years of service to return to war, so the Army doesn't have to call up new recruits. Of course, Brandon is not happy about this and voices his complaints to his lieutenant colonel, who reminds him these are orders from the president. Furious, Brandon insults the president because he's not the one on the front line risking his life. Unfortunately, Miller is also following orders, so he sends Brandon to a military prison while he waits to be sent back to Iraq. On the way to the transport, Brandon manages to overpower the guards and escape the base in Steve's Jeep. Now a deserter, he quietly returns home, slipping past a sheriff who is asking his parents about his whereabouts. As soon as the officer leaves, Brandon explains the situation to his parents. His mother supports his cause, but his father doesn't want him to get into trouble. Nonetheless, Brandon remains determined to go to Washington to seek help from Senator Orton. Since his parents can't take him because they're being watched, Michelle offers to drive him there. When they stop at a motel to rest, Brandon sees the injured Rodriguez at the bottom of the pool, so he immediately jumps in to rescue him, only to emerge holding his own jacket. Back on the road, the sergeant receives a call from Steve, who reveals that Tommy is in jail for drunk driving, a charge that will cost him his position in the Army. These are situations that Brandon, as the squad leader, should be handling, but he's busy with his own troubles. Later, the pair visits the parents of Paul, who was known as the preacher of the Army because he would baptize his comrades. After hearing how their son died, as told by Brandon, the parents give him a photo of Tommy right after his own baptism, a picture that Tommy had sent them in honor of his best friend Paul. Just then, the deceased soldier's brother tells them about a local deserter who might be able to help Brandon. When they leave, the duo discovers a broken window in their car and that their belongings are gone. Brandon runs into the thieves in an alley and confronts them in hand-to-hand combat. At first, he seems to be at a disadvantage, but using his soldier skills, he overpowers them and even takes their gun. Holding a weapon again, his war memories start blending with reality, and he mistakes the hoodlums for Iraqis, so he begins firing shots near them. Fortunately, Michelle snaps him out of it before a real tragedy occurs. Later at another motel, Brandon meets the deserter they had heard about earlier, a family man who has been on the run from military service for 14 months, meaning he can't hold a job or anything of the sort. As a last resort, he's turning to a pacifist lawyer who can provide him with false documents to cross the border. Although Brandon wants to try his luck in Washington, the deserter gives him the lawyer's number. The next day, Steve appears at Michelle's request to drive her home, but he insists on taking Brandon as well because he's worked out a deal to drop Brandon's criminal charges. Of course, Brandon would still have to fulfill his military service. Brandon deduces that Steve couldn't have gotten that deal without giving something up in return. With no other choice, Steve admits that he's going back to the front lines as a sniper. His girlfriend Michelle is frustrated by this news and breaks up with him. Still, Steve urges his friend to return to Iraq with him, where they can keep fighting for their country like before. Brandon, however, refuses to go back to that hell. Steve then drops the attempt, though they share a smile to show their friendship is still intact. After that, the sergeant tries contacting Senator Orton, but his secretary makes it clear the senator will never help a deserter. Elsewhere, Steve deals with Tommy, who has been drinking nonstop ever since his wife filed a restraining order against him. Tommy won't accept help from anyone who can't even reunite with his own fiancée. Hearing that, Steve leaves in anger, while Tommy, overwhelmed with frustration, smashes the window of a jewelry store where he saw a wedding ring. Meanwhile, Brandon visits Rodriguez in a military hospital. Rodriguez lost a leg and part of an arm in the ambush, and also suffered facial burns that left him blind. Even so, he greets his former leader warmly and remembers Michelle from photos Steve used to show them. Brandon then tells Rodriguez about his hallucination at the pool and how he couldn't save him. However, Rodriguez assures him that thanks to Brandon's leadership, he's still alive. Despite his condition, he feels quite fortunate. Back with Michelle, Brandon confesses what he did in the war. While helping Steve exit a building, he encountered an Iraqi who threatened him with a grenade. The sergeant immediately gunned the man down, including his young son. From that moment on, Brandon vowed never to kill again, an oath he would break if he returns to the military. Hearing this, Michelle encourages him to call the pacifist lawyer the deserter had mentioned earlier. In New York, they meet with the lawyer, who provides Brandon with a new identity and recommends that he say his goodbyes because it's a one-way trip. As soon as Brandon calls his mother, he gets the terrible news that Tommy took his own life at the ranch, as he had been discharged from the army and couldn't cope. At the funeral, Steve presents Tommy's fiancée with a commemorative flag. After everyone leaves, Brandon appears to pay his respects, but Steve attacks him by surprise and blames him for Tommy's death. During the scuffle, Brandon manages to pin him down near a grave and shows him that the next headstone might bear Steve's name if he returns to the army. Steve still refuses to see Brandon's point of view, so Brandon reminds him of all the allies who died under his command. His friend responds that without him, things would be worse in the war. Nevertheless, Brandon has had enough. That night, he says goodbye to both his house and his father. His mother and Michelle are the ones who accompany him to the border. Once there, Brandon can't bring himself to cross. He would have to become a new person and might never see his loved ones again. Worst of all, he won't be free of his war memories. These are scars he must learn to bear. Therefore, only one option remains. In the next scene, we see him boarding a military bus, greeting the soldiers before sitting down next to Steve. He looks out the window to say goodbye to his parents and Michelle. In the epilogue, it's revealed that since September 2001, 650,000 U.S. soldiers have fought in Afghanistan and Iraq, and 81,000 of them have had their discharges canceled. Currently, the U.S. is not at war with those countries, but this story is a clear example that they will resort to stop-loss again in the event of another conflict.
If you want interesting movie recaps, like, share, and subscribe to follow us for more movie recaps.